What if the biggest detail surrounding Deshaun Watson right now isn't the quarterback competition, the boos, or even the numbers on the scoreboard? What if it's something Watson himself already acknowledged and almost everyone simply moved past it? During the preseason, Watson said his throwing arm went numb after a play, describing it as something he initially thought was similar to hitting his funny bone. That moment may have been brief, but it immediately raises a much bigger question about where Watson really stands heading into the Browns' quarterback decision. And the timing could not be more important. Cleveland is trying to determine whether Watson can return to being the quarterback they expected when they made him one of the biggest investments in franchise history. At the same time, Shedeur Sanders is waiting for his opportunity and trying to prove that he deserves more than just a developmental role. On paper, this is supposed to be a competition based on performance, but once Watson's arm issue entered the conversation, the entire situation became much harder to look at as a simple battle between two quarterbacks. The most important thing is not to assume that the numbness automatically explains every bad throw or every struggle Watson has had. There is no proof of that. But when a quarterback openly acknowledges that his throwing arm went numb during a game, it becomes a detail that deserves attention, especially when that same quarterback is coming back from a major Achilles injury and trying to regain the form he once had. Then there is what has happened on the field. Watson has had moments where he looks comfortable, but there have also been stretches where the offense struggles to generate much downfield. Missed throws, stalled drives, and turnovers have continued to keep the conversation alive. Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders has shown flashes that make it harder for the Browns to simply dismiss him. Suddenly, every practice rep and every preseason possession carries more weight. That is what makes this situation so fascinating. Cleveland isn't simply deciding between an experienced veteran and a rookie. The organization has a massive financial commitment tied to Watson, years of history behind him, and enormous pressure to make that investment work. Sanders, meanwhile, represents something completely different, a younger option with the chance to change the direction of the quarterback room if he continues taking advantage of his opportunities. And then came the latest preseason action, where the contrast became even more noticeable. Sanders delivered several of the more impressive plays, while Watson struggled to establish the same rhythm. That doesn't automatically mean Sanders has won anything, but it does create a question the Browns eventually have to answer. How long can a team continue calling something an open competition if one quarterback keeps giving them more reasons to reconsider the original plan? There is also the pressure coming from outside the building. Browns fans have already made their feelings known, and Watson recently pushed back after being booed by Cleveland supporters. That adds another layer to a situation that was already filled with expectations. Every missed throw gets examined. Every mistake becomes part of the larger debate. Every good Sanders play creates another wave of questions about whether Cleveland should be looking in a different direction. So the real story isn't that Watson's arm went numb, and therefore everything else must have a single explanation. That's far too simple. The real story is that Cleveland now has another unanswered question sitting alongside the quarterback competition. Can Watson physically and consistently perform at the level the Browns need, and can he prove it before Sanders forces the organization to seriously reconsider the entire plan? Because if Watson gets healthy, finds his rhythm, and starts playing like the quarterback Cleveland believed it was getting, the conversation changes immediately. But if the struggles continue while Sanders keeps producing, that competition could become much more serious than anyone expected. And that is where this story really begins. The Browns wanted everyone to believe this quarterback competition was wide open. Two quarterbacks, two very different situations, and one starting job that would supposedly go to whoever proved he deserved it. On the surface, that sounds completely reasonable. Deshaun Watson had the experience, the history, and the massive contract. Shedeur Sanders had the youth, the opportunity, and something to prove. The Browns could evaluate both and make their decision based on what happened between the lines. But the closer you look, the more complicated that picture becomes.
Watson entered the competition with a built-in advantage that Sanders simply could not have. He already knew the offense. He had years of NFL experience. The organization had invested heavily in him. There was also a strong desire to see whether he could finally get back to the level Cleveland expected when it brought him in. That doesn't automatically mean the team was handing him the job, but it meant the starting point was never going to be perfectly equal. Sanders, meanwhile, had to earn every opportunity. Every throw mattered. Every mistake could be remembered. Every impressive play had to be followed by another one, because the standard for a young quarterback trying to move up the depth chart is completely different. He wasn't just competing against Watson's performances. In a way, he was competing against Watson's reputation. That distinction matters because a quarterback competition isn't truly about who has the better story. It's supposed to be about who gives the team the best chance to win. And that's where the Browns suddenly found themselves facing a much tougher evaluation than expected. Watson's path was supposed to be straightforward. Get back on the field, shake off the rust, show that the arm is still there, prove the mobility has returned, and demonstrate that he can operate the offense without hesitation. If he did those things, the experience advantage would make the decision much easier. Sanders would have time to develop, learn the system, and wait for his moment. But football rarely follows the clean script. Instead, Sanders started creating moments that demanded attention. He wasn't simply standing around waiting for Watson to fail. He was giving the coaching staff actual evidence to consider. The more competitive his performances became, the less comfortable it became to treat him like someone who is merely along for the ride. And that is exactly what makes the Browns situation so interesting. If Watson had looked dominant from the beginning, nobody would be having this conversation. His contract, his experience, and his history would make the decision almost automatic. But when the veteran quarterback struggles while the younger challenger flashes, suddenly every decision gets examined differently. The Browns also had to balance development with urgency. Sanders could not be rushed simply because fans wanted to see him play, and Watson could not be judged entirely on a handful of preseason possessions. There are legitimate reasons for a coaching staff to evaluate a veteran differently from a rookie. There are different responsibilities, different expectations, and different levels of trust. Still, eventually, the numbers and the tape have to matter. And that's where this competition began changing. The more Watson struggled to maintain consistency, the more important Sanders' opportunities became. A good throw from Sanders wasn't just a good throw anymore. It became another piece of evidence. A mistake from Watson wasn't automatically proof that he should lose the job, but it became another question the coaching staff had to answer. Then the preseason performances started putting those questions directly in front of everyone. Instead of a comfortable veteran reclaiming his position, Cleveland was watching a competition develop around him. And once that happens, the coaching staff can't simply rely on what they expected to happen before the games began. They have to respond to what is actually happening now. That's also why Watson's comments about his arm become so significant within the bigger picture. The competition was supposed to be about performance, but now there was another physical question sitting in the background. Was Watson simply working through normal rust after a long absence, or was there something else affecting his ability to consistently play the way Cleveland needed? Nobody outside the organization can answer that with certainty, and it would be unfair to pretend otherwise. What we can say is that the Browns suddenly had more questions than answers. They had a veteran quarterback trying to prove he could return to form, a younger quarterback trying to prove he deserved a bigger role, and an organization under enormous pressure to get the decision right. And then Buffalo gave the entire competition another twist. Suddenly, the difference between what the Browns expected and what they were seeing became much harder to ignore. Watson's preseason performance is where the clean story started to fall apart. The expectation was that every game would give Cleveland more evidence that he was getting closer to his old form. Instead, his performances have created another set of questions about consistency, rhythm, and whether he can actually sustain an offense when the pressure increases.
The biggest problem isn't one bad throw. Quarterbacks have bad throws all the time, especially during preseason. The concern comes from the stretches where the offense appears to lose momentum around Watson. A few early completions can make everything look fine, but then the deeper throws aren't connecting, drives stall, and suddenly the quarterback is trying to recover from mistakes instead of controlling the game.
That pattern became especially noticeable in the preseason matchup against Buffalo. Watson finished with only a handful of completions, limited yardage, and an interception. It wasn't the kind of performance that immediately settles a quarterback competition. If anything, it gave the coaching staff another reason to keep evaluating him closely. And the timing makes it even more important. Watson isn't a young quarterback being judged simply on potential. Cleveland already knows what he has done at the professional level. The entire point of this comeback is to determine whether that version of Watson can still exist after everything that has happened. Every preseason rep is therefore part of a much bigger evaluation. There were moments when Watson looked comfortable. He made some routine throws, moved the offense, and showed flashes of the veteran quarterback Cleveland believes he can still become. But those moments haven't always lasted. Once the offense has been forced to push the ball further downfield or respond after a mistake, the performance has become much less convincing. That is where the word rust starts becoming complicated. Rust is an easy explanation after a quarterback misses significant time. Timing can be off, footwork can be inconsistent, decision-making can take time to return. But rust is supposed to improve as the player gets more repetitions. If the same problems continue appearing, the coaching staff has to determine whether they're watching normal recovery or something that requires a deeper evaluation. And Watson's own comments about his arm add another layer to that question. After the preseason incident, he acknowledged experiencing numbness in his throwing arm. That does not prove that the numbness caused his inaccurate throws or limited production. There is no basis for making that medical conclusion from the outside. But it does make the performance worth watching more closely, especially when the quarterback is trying to rebuild his consistency after such a long absence. Then there's the pressure of knowing Sanders is right there. If Sanders were struggling badly, Watson's mistakes would probably receive less attention. Cleveland could simply say the veteran is working through his return while the rookie develops. But when the younger quarterback starts making explosive plays, the comparison becomes unavoidable. Suddenly, Watson isn't being evaluated in isolation. Every possession has a second quarterback waiting in the background. That creates an uncomfortable situation for the Browns. They can afford to be patient with Watson if they genuinely believe the problems are temporary, but they also have to be honest about what the tape is showing. If the veteran isn't consistently moving the offense and Sanders continues producing when given opportunities, the coaching staff eventually has to ask whether experience alone should determine the depth chart. And that's the part that could become dangerous for Watson. The Browns don't need him to look perfect in preseason. Nobody expects that. They need to see progress. They need to see the timing improve, the decision-making settle down, and the offense become more reliable as the competition moves forward. Instead, his performances have left people asking whether the comeback is progressing quickly enough. One game won't decide the job. One interception won't decide the job, and one comment about arm numbness certainly doesn't explain an entire preseason. But when those details start appearing alongside inconsistent performances, they create a bigger picture that Cleveland cannot simply ignore. Because the longer the competition continues, the more valuable every opportunity becomes for Sanders, and the more pressure falls on Watson to prove that his place at the top of the depth chart is based on what he can do right now, not what everyone remembers him doing before. The arm numbness changes the way this entire situation has to be viewed. Before that detail surfaced, it was easy to explain Watson's uneven performances as rust, timing, or simply the difficulty of returning after missing so much football. But once Watson himself acknowledged that his arm went numb during the preseason, there was suddenly another variable that could not simply be brushed aside. The important distinction is that the numbness is a confirmed part of the story, but what it means for Watson's performance is not. Nobody watching from the outside can honestly say that one episode caused his missed throws, interceptions, or struggles pushing the ball downfield. That would be speculation. What we do know is that Watson experienced the sensation in a competitive situation, and that makes the timing of his subsequent performance much more interesting.
According to the transcript, Watson initially viewed it like a funny bone type problem and moved on from it. That reaction matters because it suggests he did not publicly describe the incident as some catastrophic event.
But at the same time, a quarterback feeling numbness in their throwing arm during a game is not an ordinary detail when that quarterback is fighting to reclaim his starting position. Now, look at the circumstances surrounding him. Watson has already spent an extended period away from regular NFL action. He is trying to rebuild his rhythm, regain confidence, and convince the Browns that he can handle the responsibility of running their offense. Every throw is being evaluated. Every physical reaction is being watched. There is very little room for uncertainty. That is why the arm issue becomes the missing piece rather than the entire explanation. Without it, people can look at Watson's inconsistent stretches and simply say he needs more reps. With it, the coaching staff has another question to consider. Is Watson just working through the normal difficulties of returning, or does the arm issue deserve additional attention before the Browns make a final decision? And this is where the conversation gets much more complicated than the simple Watson versus Sanders debate. If Watson had been lighting up the preseason, the numbness might have remained a strange but isolated moment. A quarterback can experience something uncomfortable during a game and continue playing. But when the same period also includes inconsistent passing and difficulty sustaining offensive momentum, fans naturally start connecting the dots. That doesn't mean those dots actually connect. It simply means the question exists. The Browns have to be careful here because there is a huge difference between investigating a player's physical condition and assuming something is seriously wrong. The public doesn't have access to Watson's medical evaluation, and there is no basis to diagnose the cause of the numbness from a few preseason moments. So the responsible question isn't, is Watson's arm finished? The responsible question is, what does Cleveland know about the incident, and has it affected how they evaluate him? And that question becomes even more important because of the quarterback standing behind him. Shedeur Sanders doesn't need Watson to be injured for the competition to become interesting. He only needs to perform well enough to make the coaching staff uncomfortable with the status quo. Every strong Sanders possession increases the importance of Watson, proving that he can consistently deliver. And that is why the numbness incident carries so much weight in the larger story. It doesn't automatically push Sanders ahead. It doesn't prove the Browns are hiding anything. It doesn't prove Watson cannot play. But it gives context to a comeback that was already under intense scrutiny. The Browns now have to evaluate several things at the same time: Watson's accuracy, his decision-making, his ability to push the ball vertically, his confidence under pressure, his physical readiness, and, perhaps most importantly, whether all of those pieces are improving quickly enough. Because Cleveland isn't simply deciding whether Watson can still play football, they're deciding whether he can be trusted to lead the offense when the games actually matter. And if the numbness incident was just a temporary incident, Watson has the perfect opportunity to erase the concern by going out there and consistently proving it isn't affecting him. But if the performances continue to raise questions, that one preseason moment could become much more important in hindsight. And that's where the Browns' massive investment in Watson suddenly becomes impossible to separate from the football decision. The $230 million number is where this quarterback competition becomes much more complicated than a simple battle for the starting job. Cleveland didn't make a small bet on Deshaun Watson. The organization committed enormous guaranteed money to him, and that investment still hangs over every decision surrounding his return. When a team puts that much financial weight behind a quarterback, the pressure to make the decision work doesn't just disappear because the player struggles. That doesn't mean the Browns are automatically protecting Watson because of his contract. There is no proof of that. Coaches still have to evaluate what happens on the field, and the team has every reason to want the best quarterback available. But the financial reality creates an unavoidable question: how much does the past investment influence the way Cleveland views the future? Imagine making a massive investment in a quarterback, watching injuries derail his availability, and then finally getting him back on the field. You want to believe the comeback is going to justify everything that came before it. You want to see the player return to form.
You want the story to end with the investment finally paying off. That creates natural pressure, even if nobody inside the building admits it.
And Watson isn't just competing against Shedeur Sanders. He's competing against the expectations attached to that contract. Every time Watson makes a strong throw, it can be viewed as evidence that Cleveland's patience is paying off. Every time he struggles, the questions become louder. And when Sanders produces on the other side of the competition, those questions become even harder to avoid. That's what makes this situation so different from a normal preseason quarterback battle. If a rookie and a veteran were competing without all the financial history, the coaching staff could simply look at the tape and make the decision. But here, there's a massive investment sitting in the background. Cleveland has already spent years trying to make this relationship work, and that creates an emotional and organizational attachment that doesn't show up on a depth chart. There is also the reality that Watson's contract cannot be erased simply by choosing someone else. Whether Watson starts or doesn't start, the financial consequences remain. The money has already shaped the franchise, and the decision about who plays quarterback now has to be made separately from the question of what Cleveland wishes it had done differently. That's an important distinction. The Browns don't get their money back if Watson sits. They don't suddenly escape the financial consequences if Sanders wins the job. So, the smartest football decision should theoretically be based on what gives the team the best chance to win now. But that's exactly why the pressure is so intense. If Watson wins the job and succeeds, Cleveland can say the investment was worth giving another chance. If he struggles, critics will immediately point back to the contract and ask whether the organization allowed the financial commitment to influence the football decision. And if Sanders eventually takes over and performs well, those questions could become even louder. There's also another side to this. Watson's experience matters. The Browns know what he has done at the NFL level. Sanders is still trying to establish himself. A coaching staff isn't going to throw away years of professional experience simply because a rookie has a few impressive preseason moments. Watson has a resume that Sanders hasn't had the opportunity to build yet. So Cleveland has to balance two completely different kinds of value. Watson represents proven NFL experience and an enormous investment. Sanders represents uncertainty, youth, and the possibility of something new. The danger comes when those two things get confused. A player's contract should not determine whether he is the best quarterback on the field, but a contract can create expectations, it can create pressure, it can create a desire to see the original plan succeed. And when a player has already missed significant time, those expectations become even heavier. That is why Watson's performances matter so much right now. The easiest way for him to remove the contract conversation from the equation is to make it irrelevant with his play. If he starts moving the offense, hitting difficult throws, protecting the football, and looking comfortable again, nobody will need to explain why Cleveland continues giving him opportunities. But if those problems continue, the $230 million figure will keep hanging over every decision, and suddenly, the Browns won't just be asking whether Watson deserves the job, they'll be asking whether they are evaluating him based on what he can actually give them today, or whether everything they invested in him is making it harder to move forward. That's the uncomfortable question sitting behind this entire competition, because Cleveland can't change the money, it can't change the past. The only thing it can control now is who gives the team the best chance to win. And with Shedeur Sanders continuing to push for that opportunity, the Browns may soon discover that the most expensive decision isn't necessarily the best one. Shedeur Sanders suddenly has something every young quarterback needs in a competition like this: momentum. He doesn't need to prove that Deshaun Watson is finished. He doesn't need to convince the Browns that the veteran's career is over. He simply needs to keep making enough plays that the coaching staff has no choice but to take his case seriously. And that opportunity has become much bigger than it looked at the beginning. When Sanders entered this competition, the expectation was that Watson would have the advantage because of his experience. That still matters, but experience only carries a quarterback so far when the younger player starts producing with limited opportunities. Sanders has been able to create those moments, and that changes the pressure inside the quarterback room.
The Buffalo preseason game was a perfect example. Sanders completed 9 of 11 passes for 74 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. The interception obviously wasn't ideal, but neither was the overall performance from Watson. Sanders still showed enough accuracy and confidence to keep the conversation alive. He wasn't perfect, but he gave the Browns something to evaluate.
And that's exactly what he needed to do. A young quarterback doesn't have to dominate every preseason game to move up the depth chart. He has to show progress. He has to demonstrate that the game isn't moving too quickly for him. He has to make the difficult throws when the opportunity appears, recover after mistakes, and show the coaching staff that he can handle more responsibility. Sanders is getting those opportunities now. The interesting part is that Cleveland doesn't need Sanders to completely outperform Watson. The situation is more subtle than that. If Watson looks good and Sanders looks average, the veteran's experience probably wins the argument. But if Watson continues struggling while Sanders keeps producing, the gap between them becomes smaller. And once that gap becomes small enough, the Browns have a real decision. Do they continue with the veteran because they trust his experience, or do they give the younger quarterback a chance because his current performance suggests he may be the better option? That's where Sanders has suddenly created leverage. He isn't controlling the decision, but he's forcing the Browns to have the conversation. Every good practice, every explosive completion, and every confident possession makes it harder to simply say, Watson is the starter because he's Watson. At some point, the coaching staff has to separate reputation from current performance. That doesn't mean Sanders has already earned the job. He hasn't. There's still plenty of things he has to prove. The interception against Buffalo is a reminder that he is still developing, and preseason success doesn't automatically translate into regular season readiness. NFL defenses will create completely different problems once the games start counting. But Sanders doesn't need to solve every problem right now. He needs to show the Browns that there is a reason to keep giving him opportunities. And perhaps the most important thing he has done is make the quarterback competition uncomfortable. If Watson were clearly ahead, Sanders' performances wouldn't matter nearly as much. But when the veteran is still trying to find consistency and the rookie is showing flashes, the coaching staff has to pay attention. That's the opening. The bigger question is whether Sanders can turn that opening into something permanent, because one impressive preseason performance can be dismissed, two can create curiosity. A consistent stretch of strong practices and games becomes a pattern, and patterns are much harder for coaches to ignore. This is also where Sanders has an advantage that has nothing to do with money. He doesn't carry the weight of the $230 million contract. He just has to play. That freedom can be powerful. If Sanders makes a mistake, the Browns can call it development. If Watson makes the same mistake, the conversation immediately becomes much larger because of everything surrounding him. That's the reality of being the veteran with the massive contract. Sanders can simply keep climbing, and if he keeps doing that, Cleveland may eventually reach the point where the decision isn't about protecting a previous plan. It becomes about choosing the quarterback who is giving them the most reasons to believe in the future. But there is still one major question hanging over Sanders. Can he prove that these flashes are more than preseason moments? Because if he can, the Browns won't just have a quarterback competition anymore. They'll have a genuine dilemma on their hands. The arm numbness may be the detail getting the most attention, but it might not actually be the biggest problem facing Deshaun Watson right now. The larger issue is whether Cleveland can trust everything else around his game. A quarterback doesn't need one perfect throw to win a job. He needs consistency, decision-making, timing, mobility, and the ability to keep the offense functioning when things stop going according to plan. That is where Watson still has something to prove. The biggest concern isn't necessarily whether his arm is capable of making a deep throw. It's whether he can consistently make the right throw at the right time while dealing with pressure. A quarterback can have plenty of arm strength and still struggle if his reads are late, his timing is off, or he becomes hesitant after a mistake.
And some of those questions were already present before the numbness became the part of the conversation.
You can see a missed throw. You can see an interception. You can see a receiver open after the ball has already left the quarterback's hand. But you can't always see what happened inside the quarterback's decision-making process. Was he late because he didn't see the coverage? Was he hesitant because he didn't trust the throw? Was the timing simply off? Or was the pressure forcing him into decisions he wouldn't normally make? Those are the questions Cleveland has to answer. And this is where the Sanders competition becomes even more important. Sanders doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to show that he can operate the offense with confidence and continue improving. If Watson is struggling with consistency, while Sanders keeps showing that he can handle more responsibility, the Browns eventually have to compare more than their resumes. They have to compare what each quarterback is giving them right now. That's a completely different evaluation. The temptation will be to make everything about Watson's arm, because the numbness is such an attention-grabbing detail, but focusing too heavily on that one issue could actually miss the bigger picture. Even if Watson's arm is completely fine, Cleveland still needs to know whether the rest of his game is ready for the regular season. Can he protect the football? Can he make quick decisions? Can he stay composed after a bad play? Can he consistently create explosive plays without forcing the offense into unnecessary risk? Can he handle pressure without the entire operation slowing down? Those questions are just as important as arm strength. And there is another factor that can't be ignored: availability. A quarterback can have all the talent in the world, but if the Browns can't depend on him being available and physically prepared, the organization has to consider that when making its decision. That's especially true after everything Watson has already been through. None of this means Watson is incapable of succeeding. It means the standard is different now. Cleveland isn't evaluating the quarterback he used to be. They're evaluating the quarterback who is standing in front of them today. That's a difficult reality for any veteran. Your reputation can get you opportunities, but eventually the performance has to justify them. And Watson has another complication working against him. The longer the competition remains unsettled, the more time Sanders has to develop. Every additional practice gives the rookie another chance to become comfortable. Every preseason game gives him another opportunity to show that he belongs in the conversation. That creates a clock for Watson. If he can put together a stretch of strong performances, the questions become quieter. But if the same problems keep appearing, the Browns may have to stop asking whether Watson can eventually get back to his old level and start asking whether they can afford to wait for that version of him to return. That's why the biggest problem may not be the arm at all. It may be everything Cleveland has to evaluate around the arm. And if those other questions continue piling up, while Sanders keeps improving, the Browns could soon find themselves facing a decision that becomes much bigger than one preseason incident.